So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Marina Fisher. I will be your host today. And I am first just going to start with our introductions. So we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So hopefully many of you have joined us before. You are familiar with what Nickle at Noon offers. And we have fascinating topics all the time, every Thursday, 12 to 1. From September the 10th, this is when we started, until December the 10th this year, and then we will continue into the new year. You can check our website for the full programming. All the events are free. You can register on the Eventbrite website. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Maybe I'll post, I apologize for that. I do not have our email here, but I will put it in the chat. You're welcome to email us at actually nickle@ucalgary.ca. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We now have a YouTube channel where all these talks will be posted. And you can also subscribe to our mailing list and get all the information. So regarding this talk, you have seen already that we are muting everyone. It's just the best practice for the Zoom talks. So please hold questions until after the presentation. You can also use the chat. We will review it at the end when the speaker has time for questions. So also please know that the presentation will be recorded, added to our website and to our YouTube channel. Participant names and the chat will not be included in the recording. And if you speak, your voice will be included in the recording. So as I mentioned, I'm Marina Fisher from Nickle Galleries. I will be your host today. And Marla Halstead, also from Nickle Gallery. She's your co-host and managing the recording here. So for the next week, I just want to put it right here at the beginning. We have Dan Hudson Astronomical, his talk on his art. And today, we are extremely pleased to have Elizabeth Paris from the Archaeology and Anthropology Department at University of Calgary. And she will be talking about beads, beans, and bells, ancient Mesoamerican currency. But before we get going, I would really like to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth's work, which is absolutely fascinating. Elizabeth Paris is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on Mesoamerican archaeology, particularly the pre-Hispanic Maya, on topics that include the archaeology of urbanism, high-skilled craft production, and ancient commerce. She directs the economic networks of Tenam Puente project with Roberto Lopez Bravo and Gabriel Lalo Jacinto, and previously directed the economic foundations of Highland Chiapas project with Roberto Lopez Bravo. Her research also includes technical analysis of archaeological materials, including stone tools, fauna remains, and ancient metals. Her recent journal articles have been published in PLOS ONE, the Journal of Ethnobiology, the Journal of Archaeological Archaeology, Anthropozoologica, and the Journal of Field Archaeology. So please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Paris. We are very excited to have her here with us today, and we are extremely excited to hear what you have to share with us. So please, everyone, I know it's Zoom, but thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Thank you so much, Marina. I really appreciate it. I'll just share my screen here. Is it working? There we go. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your introduction. And I, again, want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you all from the Treaty 7 lands and Alberta Métis Nation Region 3. And I'd also like to acknowledge that my fieldwork that I will be talking to you about today takes place in the country of Mexico, the state of Chiapas, and the traditional lands of the Tzotzil, Tohlabal, and Yucatec Maya, principally the site that I'll be talking about, Moxviquil, is in the area, it's the traditional land of the Tzotzil Maya. So thank you all so much for coming, and I'll be talking to you today about beans, beads, and bells, ancient Mesoamerican currencies. So some of the things I'll be presenting in this talk is about currency, and specifically about ancient currency and why was it used, and what do currencies look like in ancient Mesoamerica, and how can we identify them in the archaeological record, particularly if they're unfamiliar to the modern 21st century eye. I'll be giving you a specific case study from the site of Moxviquil, Chiapas, which, as a small kingdom on the Western Maya frontier between Maya and non-Maya speaking peoples historically, was sort of a crossroads for Mesoamerican currencies. So you have ideas and value systems and from east and west. So it really is sort of an interesting intersection of all these ideas. And it was at its political apogee during a very interesting period as well, where you have a lot of changes in those value systems while other things are very much remaining the same. So this period between around AD 600 to 1200, or what we would call the late classic to early post-classic period transition. And more broadly, I hope to ask the question of how Moxviquil's currencies are part of a broader landscape of economic activity and value systems in ancient Mesoamerica. And what I hope to leave you with today is the idea that even though ancient Mesoamerican currencies might look very different to us today, that they're still part of these really interesting long distance trade networks and systems of value that underwrote a lot of ancient Mesoamerican life. So we'll start with the idea of what is currency. And if I ask you to think of a currency, probably something comes to your mind, right? Probably something that's very familiar to you. If you are an ancient coin enthusiast, something that might come to mind might be something from the ancient Mediterranean, Lydian coin, an ancient Greek coin, a Roman coin, something that is an object recognized of value even today. Others of you might think of modern coinage or promissory notes that are issued by modern 21st century governments, or maybe historically issued by a government as a government-backed currency. And still others of you might think of cryptocurrencies, where it's a non-state-backed currency generally, where you have this register of ownership where value is passed directly from owner to owner. But if we step back and take a look historically and cross-culturally, we might start to have a very different idea of what currencies can be. And so historically, if we look around the world, we often see that commodity money is really, really important, especially in early complex societies. So one of the most common cross-culturally is shell money. So we have examples from all over Asia and Africa, particularly cowrie shell money. And that was used historically as early as the Western Zhou dynasty, so around 900 BC. And as recently as right now in Papua New Guinea, shell currency can still be used as legal tender. So shell money is a very, very common type of currency cross-culturally, and we'll see that that is also true in ancient Mesoamerica. You might think of metals as associated with currency, and there's lots of historic examples of copper money. We have this rather cumbersome Swedish plate money from 1715. And we also have other types of copper money from Africa. One example might be the Katanga cross from what is now Zaire in the early 20th century. We might also think of things like trade beads, which were produced en masse in Europe and used specifically for the purpose of enacting exchanges with indigenous peoples of Africa and the Americas. We might think of consumable types of money like powdered black tea bricks, which were very common in Northeast Asia, and especially during the 19th century, where you could literally eat your money. And we'll see that that's also true in ancient Mesoamerica. And finally, we have special purpose money. So for example, cattle in southern Sudan are very important in certain types of transactions, particularly negotiating marriages. So we can have general purpose money, we could have special purpose money and currencies can look like a lot of different things. So why do we use currency? What is the purpose of all of these objects and coins and papers that we have cross-culturally and historically to work with? Well, if from an economic anthropology perspective, there's 5 basic uses of currency. And to be a currency, a particular item has to be fulfilling at least one, if not more, of these things. So first of all, you have a medium of exchange. So a currency facilitates exchange, it facilitates trade. And in ancient Mesoamerica, this was really important because ancient Mesoamerica was never a unified political or economic system. You have a lot of different cultural groups, you have a lot of different political entities, and you have a lot of social stratification. You have different ranks and class systems. So trade or currency facilitates exchange among all those very, very different groups, and both sides of the exchange still feel like they have something of value. Finally, the unit of account. So a unit of account is an abstract measure of value or worth. So in the modern world, that might be the Canadian dollar or the British pound or the American dollar or the euro. And in the ancient world, it might be something a base unit that everything was counted in. And the best evidence for the most common unit of account in ancient Mesoamerica was the cacao bean, a very small increment unit of account, especially by the Postclassic period. A lot of the value of different commodities and in fact other currencies are being accounted in cacao beans. Store of value, allowing wealth to be preserved over time. So in the modern world, we might think about this in terms of accumulating wealth for some purpose, maybe spending it, or for something like retirement. But in ancient agrarian states, such as the kind that you find in ancient Mexico, a store of value is a really great way to offset natural disaster and tragedy. So especially if you're relying on staple crops like corn, beans, and squash, and you have something happen like a hurricane, like the 2 hurricanes that have just passed through the northern Yucatan. You might have a drought, or you might have flooding that wipes out a crop in a particular locality or region. But other neighboring areas might have their crops preserved, and so they might have a surplus. And so that store of value saved for a rainy day can literally save people from famine. So it becomes very, very important, not only on the individual or family level, but also on the broader political level in terms of maintaining the stability of political systems over time. It could also be a standard of deferred payment, so a measure of debt, the amount of debt that a person or a province might owe to another entity, another person, another polity, an empire. And finally, it could be a means of payment. So a way that you could pay in a market transaction in the marketplace, but then also in a non-market situation, like if you are paying taxes to a state or empire. So here are some examples of Mesoamerican currencies. And you can see they're very diverse, but there's also some stability in terms of value systems over time. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today, is what are the kinds of currencies, what is their history, very briefly, obviously, we don't have time to be encyclopedic, but just generally speaking, their history, and where we see them emerging as items of value that have eventually become standardized and broadly used over time. So we've got shell beads. As I'll talk about further, there's basically 3 types of shells that always have value, are always important all the way across Mesoamerica. You have these small discoidal beads, which are usually made from conch shell. You have these beads that, when they're not bleached by the sun, are a beautiful color of red. Those are made from the spiny oyster or spondylus shell, and then olive shell, which are usually perforated and made into these little ornaments that could be worn on the body if you want to. The probably vying with shell beads for the oldest currency is greenstone. And when I say greenstone, some of that greenstone is jadeite, but it could also be other minerals like amphasite or serpentine that also have that green color. And in Mesoamerican archaeology, we usually call that social jade. So things that had that value because of their color and not necessarily because they're 100% jadeite. So we have this form, probably the oldest form is the greenstone axe, the ultimate agricultural symbol of fertility and land management. And then also greenstone beads in roughly the same kinds of shapes as the shell. We also have comestible and perishable currencies. So here are the cacao beans, which of course are ground up and used to make chocolate in the modern world. In the ancient world, they could be money, but they could also be eaten or ground into powder and used to make a drink, usually with a little bit of chili added. So in the ancient Mesoamerican world, money literally grew on trees and you could eat or drink your money, which is delightful. You also had another comestible currency, cakes of salt. Historically, there have been other cultural groups that used salt as currency, specifically Ethiopia. And in ancient Mesoamerica, there's a lot of evidence that cakes of salt with the water boiled out from either the sea or an inland geological source formed into standardized loaves and traded. You also have cotton textiles, and these are probably best known as currency from their use in the Aztec tax systems, but probably quite a bit before that, we see depictions of them in the classic Maya vases in bundles. And so cotton textiles were a very valued item and currency. They could be made into standardized sizes and colors and valued according to that. Eventually, once metallurgy developed in Mesoamerica, copper also came in, and in a lot of ways, when copper came in, it paralleled and mirrored the value systems that were already in place from these other types of currency. And so a lot of the shapes tend to be quite similar to the shapes that you already see portrayed in shell and greenstone. So you got copper axes, these little miniature axes down here, which are not too dissimilar from the greenstone axes, copper bells, which are not too dissimilar from the olive shell tinklers, and then this rather interesting form of money called the copper axe money. These are very, very thin, usually just a few millimeters. They're in this effigy axe shape, and they could be bundled in little packets and then traded either individually or together as a bundle. So copper metalworking came into Mesoamerica approximately 600 AD and spread to other areas of Mesoamerica in terms of production and especially trade by around AD 1200. So it is a latecomer, but very quickly gained importance within ancient Mesoamerican value systems. Another thing that I want to emphasize in this talk is that one of the reasons why these currencies and systems of value are so diverse is because Mesoamerica itself was culturally and linguistically diverse. You never had political unification of the entire region. And in fact, even within language areas or culture areas, you never had political unification. So even in this area that we're showing as being Maya, this Maya culture area, there are 38 modern Mayan languages that are spoken. And in the ancient world, there were lots of different kingdoms that had alliances and conflicts and all sorts of different kinds of relationships. So that meant that there was never a single political entity that was driving standardization of currency. It was never unified. Rather, you have these broad systems of value that are widely shared that allow these very, very different regions to trade with each other across long distances. And also you have an incredible diversity of then currency materials that are very geographically dispersed. And so in order to get currency across Mesoamerica, you had to trade it over long distances itself. And in order to get it distributed to a fair number of people. As you can see, different materials have widely different availabilities. So cotton is probably the most widely available. So cotton, basically anywhere that is a lowland area that does not have a frost during the winter, and as long as it has a very distinct wet and dry season, so a rainy season and a dry season, cotton will grow in a lot of areas. So that was fairly widespread, but then you had to do the labor to spin it, weave it, dye it, embroider it, whatever you were going to do. So while it was widespread, it did require a lot of labor, historically of women, to turn it into a currency product. The possibly the second most widespread, although still very geographically niche, is the cacao. So the cacao beans, again, grow on trees, and those trees only grow in areas that are very humid year round, so hot and humid. So most of those are coastal areas. So we have the Pacific coast of Mexico and Guatemala, also known as the Soconusco. You have the Ulo Valley of Honduras, and you have the Gulf Coast in what is today Tabasco. You also have some secondary growing areas, the ones in light green. So lots of areas of Belize, Guatemala, and Western Honduras, and then some around the Gulf Coast and a bit on the Pacific coast of West Mexico, but it's pretty geographically restricted. You also have metal. So you have copper deposits, gold deposits, and tin deposits, which I'm not showing here, but you do have them. And those possibly even more restricted. You're looking at igneous deposits in the mountains of West Mexico, central Oaxaca, and this small deposit in northwest Honduras. So that means that if it's coming to Moxviquil, which is located here, it's coming over quite a long distance. You also have salt, which is very common on the coasts, but less common inland where a lot of the big political centers are located. But in a couple places, you do have geological deposits that allow for salinas or salt wells. And possibly the best known is this one right here, the Lake Texcoco salt source, which was the primary salt source of the Aztec Empire. But in the Maya area, you have some small salt sources, including this one, Salinas de los Nueveseros, in what is today Guatemala. And this one right here, not too far from Moxviquil, named Ixtapa. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And finally, you have Greenstone, possibly vying for salt with the most geographically restricted. The only known source of jadeite is in the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala, and you also have some serpentine deposits in central Chiapas and then a little bit in West Mexico, but it's very rare. So this was a very precious material. People went quite out of their way to get it, but it's very geographically restricted in terms of where it's found. So how did these goods get turned into currencies and then widely exchanged? There's a couple different ways. You have these dugout canoes that could be large seagoing canoes, sort of medium-sized river-going canoes like this one. But unfortunately, Mesoamerica does not have beasts of burden. If you've ever tried thinking about what would happen if you put a saddle on a white-tailed deer, you can probably imagine that it would be very, very difficult. So, unfortunately, people had to carry it on their backs over land on these large backpacks with the strap that goes around the forehead called a tumpline. And we have lots of images and artwork of people doing this. It's a very laborious task. We also know that merchants and vendors were responsible for distributing both a lot of the currencies and then the valuable goods that they were being traded for. We don't know exactly when merchants arose within Mesoamerican history, but by 600 AD or so, they're being depicted frequently in artwork. Not very frequently. Kings generally tended to display themselves and deities and especially the royal artwork, but merchants do show up. And the best known example is the Chicna murals of Calakmul Campeche. And so in this scene, we have an atole vendor, and the vendors are shown with a customer, and above their heads is the name of whatever it is that they are vending. So this person, this woman here, is called the atole person. So they have been interpreted as vendors. And then also shown in the same murals are depictions of long distance merchants with these very distinctive sun hats or sombreros, holding with their staffs in order to travel, presumably long distances, and the packs on the backs with the tump lines. And then we also know by the Aztec Empire, the Pochteca merchant guild was very powerful, and ethnohistoric sources, especially Spanish observers, wrote down quite a bit about the Pochteca merchant guild and the long distance trading missions that they went on all across Mesoamerica, and the fact that they even served as spies for the Aztec emperor. So by the Postclassic, we know that there is a very robust merchant guild, but it actually had all these antecedents in early Mesoamerican history as well. So to come to our case study now, the Jovel Valley of Highland Chiapas is located in the country of Mexico in the southeast periphery, so not too far from the modern day border with Guatemala. It's located in this area here, the central highlands of Chiapas, which reaches altitudes of over 7,000 feet. So quite cold seasonally. And but you also have these lowland areas that surround it in all directions. Within the Jovel Valley itself, Moxviquil is the largest site, and it dominates the northern edge of the valley. There's also some smaller sites, and CV38 and Ixtapa, a contemporaneous site on the other side of the valley. But we'll focus today on Moxviquil. So Moxviquil was politically active from AD 500 to 1200, but people still lived in the valley right up and through Spanish contact. You know, people were still there, and we still find artifacts that date after 1200. But from everything we can tell, Moxviquil was no longer a dominant political center by that period. The principal excavation of the monumental zone took place in the 1950s by a fellow named Franz Blom, very famous archaeologist, and he excavated the monumental zone, which, as you can see, is this artificially landscaped hillside. When you see it today up here, it just looks like a natural hill, but there's very little natural about it. The whole landscape was shaped by artificial terraces, and then you had the residence of the royal family up here at the top, and then a series of descending terraces connected by a large monumental staircase, and then the public architecture is in the saddle behind the hill. You can't see it in this photo, but there's a large main plaza, a ball court, and 3 small temples. And then on these terraces in the middle, there are a lot of different residences. In 2009, Roberto Lopez Bravo and I started the Economic Foundations of Highland Chiapas project, which was examining, among other things, the residential component of Moxviquil, and we conducted excavations on all these hilltops to the west of the monumental zone. So looking at the map, here's the monumental zone with quite a few tombs and caches from the ruling family and other high-ranking nobility. So there's quite a few of those. On this hilltop just to the west, you have sort of a mixed rank residential zone. So you have some large houses, you have some small houses, and a lot of, again, artificial terraces where people are basically expanding the horizontal living space as much as possible by shoring up the terraces that were sort of there naturally with artificial stonework. And then halfway down the hill slope of this residential zone, you also have a funerary cave. And if you want to read more about that, we published an article last year that will tell you more. So the currencies that we find at Moxviquil are incredibly diverse, and they're all the way from some of the oldest known currencies in Mesoamerica to some of the latest. You have really quite the full spectrum. So we have these shells, we have olive shells, we have some smaller beads, we have greenstone axes and greenstone beads, and we have metal miniature axes, a copper axe money. I threw in these 2 little ear spools. They're not actually currency, they're ornaments, but I'll show you why those are important towards the end of the talk. So at Moxviquil, one thing I want to point out before we move on to the history of a lot of these currencies and the details of where they're found, I wanted to point out that a lot of these currencies are also ornaments, right? So the shell and the greenstone especially are mostly beads, and they could be worn on the body if desired. And that means that you're more likely to find them in both residential and funerary contexts. So for example, the olive shell tinklers were found in a tomb 3, and most of the greenstone beads and the small shell beads were also found in the funerary cave. But there's a lot of currencies that aren't, that suggest that they were possibly available to a broader population. Franz Blom found a greenstone bead associated with this temple here, Temple B. And then in our excavations, we found 2 of the greenstone axes in association with this residential structure in the terrace. So it does suggest that the currencies were not just luxury ornaments that are being used by the rulers, that there's a bit more commercial activity taking place throughout the population. I will note, however, we did not find any currencies in the smallest and least affluent members of society. So it does suggest that maybe everybody in theory could access them, but in practice, maybe not a lot of people could afford them if they were at the lower end of the social ladder. So moving through the different currencies, we'll start with shell currencies. And these olive shell tinklers, again, were found in the royal tomb, tomb 3 in the monumental zone. And then these 2 small beads were found in the funerary cave. So we have a conch shell discoidal bead, and this is a dentalium or tusk shell that was made into a tubular bead. These are actually pretty rare in Mesoamerica, so we were excited to find it. And they're not the only ones. Looking across the highlands to the eastern highlands at the site of Tenam Puente, where we have a new project, we found an olive shell tinkler there as well. And this particular one happened to be in the main plaza, but previously my colleague Gabriel Lalo Jacinto has found many of these in tombs in the acropolis of the site. So it does suggest that these types of currencies are coming into lots of different areas of the highlands during that period, a late classic to early post-classic period. But shell beads go back a lot further in Maya history, and they're found all over northern Belize. So these sites that are shown on the map here, Cerro Maya, Nohmul, Cachob, San Esteban, Cuello, and Colha, all in northern Belize, have not only shell beads, but also the small stone drills that were used to make them. So currency and ornaments are being made and used from about 900 BC, which is pretty early. You have 3 types of shells that are particularly focused on and have durability throughout Mesoamerican history. You do have some others like freshwater clams and things like that that are also being used for currency and ornaments. But the ones that are really focused on are these, the strombus or the conch shell, the spondylus or the spiny oyster, and the olive shell. And we see all 3 of those being displayed at the site of Cachob, this very early tomb of an ancestor, a middle-aged man who was buried under the house floor, and he had over 2,000 shell beads and ornaments buried with him, which is quite a lot. So these are in the context of a funerary deposit. They are often used as ornaments as well, so showing that value, having a little bit of liminality and slippage between, is it an ornament, is it a currency? Probably both. We don't know exactly where that line is, where things that were used as ornaments were also currency, but we do see shell bead make production processes and use going back to this date, to 900 BC. And even back then, you can see a lot of the same forms that we're seeing at Moxviquil, these discoidal shell beads, and here are the olive shell tinklers. And then there's a lot of other very beautiful ornaments in other shapes. We have a little crab here and a little frog and lots of other symbolic elements as well. And David Friedel and his colleagues have argued that during the formative period, kings really emphasized these materials and encouraged their use and promoted them by tying them to sacred matter and sacred beings. So these are some stucco masks from the site of Cerro Maya. And this is a deity who's wearing the earliest known valued materials also used as currency. So we have jade ear spools and then shell dangling down as ornaments from the ear spools. So this is drawing a deliberate parallel between sacred beings and valued materials. And then in addition to that, early kings were including these valuable items in caches dedicated to deities. So you have conch shell, you have spondylus shell, and you have greenstone that are being incorporated into these sacred caches. And Friedel and his colleagues have argued that this was to establish almost a spectrum of value that was mutually reinforcing between the more simple forms that were used as sort of everyday objects and currency and the most elaborate ornaments and offerings that were being dedicated to deities. So it was a mutually reinforcing value system. And Friedel and his colleagues have argued that this, again, was partially to make these materials a valid store of value to offset potential droughts, famines, shortages in early Mesoamerica. And these systems of value persist all the way up to the Spanish arrival. So here we have some examples from the post-classic period site of Mayapan. So after 1150, we have, again, very familiar forms, the olive shell tinkler, the discoidal conch shell bead, and here we have the remains of production of conch shell beads, so taking place at the city itself. So these are very, very durable currencies. And still in the post-classic, rulers are promoting these shell currencies, linking them to deities and sacred matter. Here are two different depictions of the god Quetzalcoatl, also known in the Maya area as Kulkulkan. Here he's shown in the Dresden Codex, a early Maya book from the post-classic period where he's wearing these olive shell tinklers around his neck. And here's the second depiction in a watery creation scene from a mural at Mayapan, where he's wearing this shell around his waist. And we see this in central Mexico as well. Here's a central Mexican depiction of Quetzalcoatl from the Codex Borbonicus. Here are his olive shell tinklers around his neck. And here is a bisected conch shell that he's wearing around the waist. So again, this relationship between currency and sacred matter and a continuum of value between them, mutually reinforcing. We also have greenstone currencies at Moxviquil, and these are really interesting. We have some that appear to have actually doubled as useful utilitarian tools and others that do not. So the miniature axes shown here, we took a closer look at them under the microscope and they actually have use wear on the bit. These two do, where they're actually probably being used for woodworking or something like that. We also have this tiny little guy, little effigy axe that is most certainly not a utilitarian item. It is very small. Using it, you'd probably accidentally whack your fingers on something, whatever you're trying to carve. And we looked at the bit under the microscope and it is pristine. There is no evidence that it was used ever on anything. So we think that this was actually deliberately manufactured as an effigy axe, as a form of currency, effectively functioning as an ingot. So almost a store of wealth and a unit of axe-shaped greenstone value. You also have the greenstone beads in a lot of different shapes, these cylindrical forms, the discoidal forms, and a rather fanciful form that we think is a stylized jaguar, but honestly, it's a bit hard to tell. And all of these were found in the funerary cave, and all of these were found on residential terraces. So it's really interesting that the axe form of the currencies are doubling as useful items and are found mostly in residences, and the ones that are more ornamental that you can wear on the body are being found mostly in funerary contexts in the funerary cave. So looking back at the history of these kinds of objects, again, we're going back to 900 BC, this time a little further west to the Olmec heartland, where you have sites like La Venta, and then also other sites where Olmec influence was observed in the artwork and observed in artifacts. So you have sites like Chiapa de Corzo, and then a number of sites on the coast of Chiapas, what is today Chiapas, but Olmec influence was surprisingly strong, and you see it pop up in a lot of areas of the Maya culture area. The site of La Venta itself has a lot of different ways that greenstone is being used in sacred matter to promote incipient complex societies and people of rank. So you have these very large monumental zones, and you have serpentine mosaic pavements that were made that incorporate over 500 blocks of serpentine. That's a lot of serpentine. You also have smaller caches like this offering 4, where you have these stone celts and anthropomorphic figures, most of which are made out of greenstone as well. You also have a tradition of greenstone axes and caches, so where they're buried with other sacred objects, often devoted to supernatural forces in general, or possibly to a specific supernatural being. But most of these are found again in middle formative period centers. The recently discovered Aguada Phoenix in Tabasco, Chiapa de Corzo in central Chiapas, and then Cival and Ceibal in northeast Guatemala. And these are forming parts of sacred caches where you have the greenstone axes and other objects being very carefully arranged in significant patterns. In this particular case, they're sort of in this quadripartite pattern that is so important to Mesoamerican sacred geography. So again, from the earliest time period, the axe form, the symbol of agriculture, is really, really important and being transformed into an object of value and an object of sacred devotion. And then in its more, let's say, quotidian apparition, you have in the post-classic period, the jade bead becomes an object of taxation. So this is from the province of Soconusco, which was the Aztec-controlled province on the coast of Chiapas, and they were required to regularly send 2 strings of jade beads. Again, remember, this is only found in the Motagua area, which the Aztec did not control. So the Soconusco province had to obtain jade beads from outside their area of political control and then send them to central Mexico at regular intervals. Interestingly, we also see that part of their tax burden includes cacao beans, quite a lot of them. So again, part of this interplay of value systems of both commercial exchange and taxation from political entities. We also have salt. So salt cakes, as I mentioned, they're found mostly, salt is mostly found on the coast and a couple small inland sites. We know that salt was valuable for a very long time in Mesoamerica. On the Chicna murals, you have ahatzam, so the salt vendor or salt person. And then by the time we hit the Spanish contact period, the Spanish are observing that the Aztecs on the shores of Lake Texcoco are thickening, boiling, and forming salt into balls and loaves, and then they take them to markets or fairs to exchange for other things. So this very clear record of how salt is being used in markets as currency and commodity by the Aztecs. Closer to Moxviquil, we have the salt works at Ixtapa. So here's the Ixtapa Valley. It's located halfway between the Highlands and the Central Depression, almost exactly halfway. We don't think that Moxviquil ever controlled Ixtapa. There was another site in the Ixtapa Valley, La Tortuga, that probably controlled the salt works. We don't know what the relationship was exactly between Moxviquil and La Tortuga, but at the very least, Moxviquil could have served as a distribution area between the salt works at Ixtapa and other points east to the Maya culture area. You have the salt works still being used today. You have the salt well here. There's still a family that's been running it for generations, and they make these cakes of salt in these cylindrical mats that are sold still in Highland markets, mostly to traditional ritual practitioners. And we know that the salt wells were really important because there was actually a war conflict between Zinacantan, located in the next valley over from Moxviquil, and Chiapa de Corzo in the Central Depression, where they actually burned down parts of Ixtapa, and then also the dispute landed in the Spanish courts, a very serious legal matter. And obviously the salt was incredibly valuable, and both polities really wanted to control it and were willing to inflict violence to do so, actually. Cotton cloth production as well. We don't have any textiles that have survived at Moxviquil. There are some that have survived in other parts of Chiapas and dry caves. Cotton actually won't grow at Moxviquil. It's too high altitude and the frost will kill the plants. But it can be grown in the neighboring Central Depression. And actually, there is a history during the colonial period of the Spanish mayor of San Cristobal de las Casas, now called formerly called Ciudad Real, where as part of the labor tax or repartimiento, the governor was importing cotton from the Central Depression, and as part of the labor tax of the Highland people was forcing them to spin it as part of the labor tax. And during the 1760s got over 100,000 pounds of cotton thread as part of the labor tax. Incredibly exploitative, but it does show that historical relationship perhaps between growers in the lowlands and spinners in the highlands. Now, what will grow in the highlands is maguey, this spiky plant here more recently known for things like tequila and mezcal, but historically very important for clothing, ships' ropes, utility fibers such as baskets, and comestibles such as syrup and pulque, a fermented beverage. Again, at Moxviquil, we don't see the cloth itself, but we do see weaving tools, we see awls, and we see a lot of spindle whorls. And not only do we see the cotton size, which are very small, but we also see these larger maguey size spindle whorls. So they're probably doing both types of cloth production. And very interestingly, we haven't found spindle whorls in many residential contexts except the monumental zone. A lot of spindle whorls are found as in elite contexts, so elite residences and elite tombs, which is really interesting. It makes us think that maybe cotton cloth production was restricted in some way at Moxviquil. And finally, we have copper axes, Axe-Monies, and earspools. So metal, again, not able to be produced anywhere near Moxviquil, or indeed in a lot of areas of the Maya culture area. The copper deposits are found elsewhere, and most metalworking practices originally developed in Mesoamerica in West Mexico, as well as the Huastec region. And then you had some, especially gold working happening in Oaxaca, and some copper working in Northwest Honduras near that source. By the late Postclassic, a lot of other cities, including Tenochtitlan and Mayapan and Lamanai and Tututepec, have their own metalworking industries where they're importing both the raw material and the technology. But as far as we know, this hadn't happened yet while Moxviquil was politically active. Here are some of the items from West Mexico. You can see these metal workers with their blowpipes and their small furnace. Here's a small axe, not too different from the ones we're seeing at Moxviquil. And they're making items like these. They're making copper bells, they're making Axe-Monies, and they're making little chisels and rings. We also have production at Mayapan, but again, this is probably after 1200 AD. We have production implements and fragments of molds. We have vessels filled with copper. We have a lot of copper bells, and we have the first blowpipe tips ever discovered in ancient Mesoamerica. We just published an article on that. Check it out if you're interested. Now in central Chiapas, most of the metal is from Chiapa de Corzo, and it's very late, so after AD 1200. But there is some metal that gets traded in earlier. And at Moxviquil, a lot of its neighbors also seem to have metal. So these are sites in the eastern highlands, closer to the Guatemala border. We have Chincoteac and we have Canahaste, also getting metal in the post-classic period. And then we also have the copper axes. So Canahaste and Las Margaritas, again, in the eastern highlands. We have a slightly similar axe at the site of El Sumidero, which is in the Central Depression, the Zoque-speaking area, just not too far from Chiapa de Corzo. Also has a miniature axe. So again, these are getting around, right? It's not just at Moxviquil. These are part of larger trade networks where lots of contemporaneous sites might have similar looking axes, possibly exchanged by similar groups of merchants. And finally, we have the copper Axe-Monies and earspools at Moxviquil and Chiapa de Corzo. Now, this is really interesting because supposedly this is late post-classic, But if you look at how similar the two Axe-Monies are and how similar the earspools are in terms of size and style, it's really striking. And we've actually hypothesized that maybe you had long distance merchants who were traversing this political and cultural frontier and exchanging goods on both sides of the border. So just to sum up, we have a lot of diverse currencies at Moxviquil, all the way from the earliest known types of currencies in Mesoamerica. We have the shell, and we have the greenstone axes and beads, to the latest known currencies, the copper miniature axes, Axe-Monies, and although we don't have them at Moxviquil, copper bells within the broader Highland Chiapas region. So what does all this mean, and why is it important? At Moxviquil, it is interesting that most of the currency ends up in elite funerary contexts, especially the ones that are ornaments and can be worn on the body, but not exclusively. So it does suggest that middle status houses do have some access to currency as well. They're not just ornaments. They're not just luxury items. They are things that middle rank families can attain. And again, we're seeing the combination of goods and value systems, old and new, east and west. And probably these currencies are coming into the area as trade items for local products. We don't know exactly which local products. There's a lot of possibilities, and probably one of the most important was salt from the Ixtapa source. More broadly, I want to leave you with the idea that even if we don't immediately recognize them as currency, a lot of ancient currencies might be something that are important, but not necessarily as familiar to the Western gaze. They might be consumable or used to adorn the body, both in life and death. And we need to start recognizing these. And one way we can do that is with the help of ethnohistorical records. So both Spanish and Indigenous records, wherever we can find them, and also cross-cultural comparisons that can help us recognize ancient currencies when we see them. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions.
And thank you so much, Liz. This was incredible. I truly enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.
Would like to, yeah, fantastic. We would like to open the time for questions. And maybe Marla, can you change the view so that we can see ourselves?
Actually, that's up to Elizabeth to take the sharing off, and then you can see the screen.
Okay. Oh, wonderful.
Gallery view.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Awesome. So anybody feel free to unmute yourselves. Feel free to ask questions. You can also write them in the chat if you prefer that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Hi, Mark. Go ahead.
Hi.
Elizabeth, thank you for the talk. That was wonderful. I noticed, okay, so the name of the talk is about currencies. I noticed that you use the word money a few times, and at the end you sort of get a little into this topic. I guess maybe we could press a little on the semantic range of the two terms, because
Sure.
I come from Greco-Roman numismatic studies, and there's like a pretty hard distinction between the two. And a lot of what you discussed in this talk, I would normally think about as, ritual deposits, some stores of values. You know, I would think of things like the Corinthian helmets that are deposited at Olympia, things like that. And then I would very strongly contrast that with like coined money, certainly, precious metal ingots, things like that. I guess when I say this, though, obviously I see where you're coming from, and you sort of elaborated on this a little. Could I get you to elaborate a little bit more, and sort of what's the state of maybe Mesoamerican studies on the topic of money specifically, and where does the sort of tension between those two terms fit into your work? Like how much work do you have to do to make them kind of compatible, or to have them sync up?
Sure. Thank you for the question. That's a great question. I would say that especially when we're talking about ancient currencies, one of the popular ways that currency and money are defined as distinct things is that money is a store of value where currency is often defined as not a store of value. That's a definition that you'll see sometimes. And I think that as we have to be so careful because especially with a lot of ancient coins, you know, a lot of things have value because either they are broadly popularly accepted or they're backed by a government. So it has to be kind of one of those two. And even if we think of precious metals, gold and silver, one of the reasons why they are so widely considered to be a store of value is that history, right? They go all the way back in Western history to the beginning of coinage. So just because there are so many places around the world that have deep histories of gold, silver, precious metals being used as a store of value, then that makes them more money-like to people, you know. But so I think that there's a resonance where people recognize metal to be this inherently valuable thing. But really, a lot of that has to do with the history. And in Mesoamerica, there is that history, but there's also another history where shell and greenstone especially have that history and are considered all the way through the Spanish contact and beyond, actually into the colonial period, to be this store of value, a medium of exchange. And in fact, one of the first things that the Spaniards did when they came is to take over the cacao orchards of the Soconusco and start using the cacao to facilitate transactions. So they weren't oblivious to it at all. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this, is that we can see these systems of value and we can see them develop. And it's really hard to say the exact historical moment where it's like, oh, it's not an ornament anymore, it's currency now. I don't think there was ever that hard line. I think there were these mutually reinforcing systems of value that happened for shell and greenstone in the ancient Mesoamerican world, the same way that they did for precious metals in the Mediterranean. Maybe not exactly the same, but there's a parallel there. Did that answer your question?
That's great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Awesome. Next question.
There's a question on chat there.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I see. Michelle has asked, what is the difference between a form of currency and a commodity? We're really breaking down into definitions. And I would say that a lot of economists would call the types of currency that I'm describing, there's a commonly used term, commodity money, that is contrasted with things like fiat money, which is a government-backed currency. And I think in ancient Mesoamerica, that definition is a bit problematic, honestly, because a lot of the commodity money, if we're using that term, I've used the broad term currency on purpose because it's very broad. But if we want to get into the nitty-gritty of the definitions, this would be commodity money, but it's also kind of being backed by governments, right? Because you have ancient Mesoamerican kings who are promoting these materials. You have the Aztec Empire specifically requiring that taxes be paid in things like greenstone beads and cacao seeds, and you have them explicitly creating these exchange values where say 1 rabbit is worth 4 cacao beans and a certain type of cloth is worth 400 cacao beans. And we actually have these records, these amazing ethnohistorical records from central Mexico from the contact period that actually tells us what the exchange values were between cacao beans and other types of currency and between cacao beans and other commodities. So I think there's a lot more slippage than most economists working today might be comfortable with. And that's actually a thing that I think we can celebrate and be interested in, how exactly that worked and how ancient Mesoamerican rulers like Maya kings and Aztec emperors were, you know, maybe sticking their thumb in the pie a little bit and trying to encourage trade by requiring particular types of currency payments, were sending out these merchants on specific missions to get things like jade beads from outside the Aztec Empire. That's kind of the perspective from which I come to this.
Awesome. So Michelle says, so different level of consensus. Yes. Mark has a follow-up on chat, but I just want to open for someone else just in case if we have another question, and then we'll come back to you, Mark. And Liz, you have some really wonderful comments in the chat as well, thanking you for the presentation. And yeah, so here, Mark, I hope you don't mind. We're just going to take this question first. Liz,
Bill had one before me as well.
Oh, okay. Let me double check. But Liz, yeah, you have a question if you want to check it out.
Okay. I'm just looking.
Oh, yes,
okay.
thank you.
From Bill Dalzell writes, can you talk a little bit about the transition from currencies that had a practical function, i.e. axes showing wear, into those that did not, particularly the later axe money? Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. And I think that it's less of a transition and more that they're existing in parallel, because a lot of the axes that we're seeing in those early caches, such as the ones that I showed. Do you mind if I share my screen for just a second?
Yeah, go for it.
Let's see. So we have these. Let's see if I can do this. Share screen. So we have these items here from all of these early caches, you know, the middle formative period, also into the late formative period, and none of these are used. So these are all what we would call effigies, effigy currencies. And so, but they had parallels with useware. They had real life versions that were being made in stones like chert or you know, like a really hard siliceous limestone, or you could make them out of other groundstone materials like granite or andesite. So we have a lot of parallels in terms of the form. And some greenstone axes were used and others weren't. And often I think the manufacturers themselves may have had some intentionality in terms of what it was going to be used for when it was made, because the most elaborate, the most maybe luxurious were the ones that I think maybe from the beginning would have been destined for these sacred arrangements of objects. But they also then, I didn't unfortunately have time to show everything in this presentation, but they had, let's say, real world parallels where people were using axes that looked almost exactly like this, maybe of different materials, for doing ordinary household woodworking and land clearing for agriculture and all sorts of very ordinary everyday tasks. So that's kind of, especially with the axes, where I come down. But I do think that as time goes on, maybe you see a bit of diversification in terms of the shapes and forms, especially with that little effigy axe. I've actually never seen anything like it at another site. So that's kind of interesting. And then with the axe money in copper, that's obviously a very large, very elaborate, paper thin piece that really could not have been used as a practical tool, even if you wanted to. The small copper miniature axes, you could use them theoretically if you wanted to for woodworking, but I've never actually seen useware on the bit of one. Not the ones that I've examined. There might be others that I'm just not familiar with, but at least in theory you could. Pure copper is a bit soft, honestly. You'd rather have one in bronze, tin bronze, which they did have by AD 1200 as well. Didn't have time to go into that quite as much, but the Axe-Monies, absolutely you could not use them. They really are functioning. I won't say paper money, but they're a symbol. They're being used and traded as a symbol, and you could melt them down into another thing, and they would have value that way. So for that reason, probably a lot of modern economists would kind of fall on the side of calling them commodity money. But really those definitions fit a bit imperfectly in the ancient Mesoamerican context. So. Thanks, Bill, for the question. Did I answer it?
Liz, there is one more question.
Yes, thank you. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking.
Liz, there is one great question about cocoa beans, and it's right here in the chat.
Okay.
And we'll probably have to wrap up right there.
Sure, absolutely. And if anybody else has additional questions, I'm happy to answer them. My email is elizabeth.paris@ucalgary.ca. I'll pop it in the chat. Yeah, feel free to email me. Let's see. So Jay Hislop asks, I understand how metals, greenstones can be currencies, but wonder the objects that seem to be so perishable, such as cacao beans and even cotton textiles, can be currencies and stores of values. How long could cacao beans be preserved? The answer is not too long. And so actually the Aztec Empire did run into this problem. It was something they were very concerned about. And they actually, at a certain point in the life history of a cacao bean, if it started looking very dry and shriveled, it would actually be worth less in the marketplace than a nice new cacao bean. And there's this wonderful passage in the Florentine Codex by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and his indigenous collaborators to make this encyclopedic description of life in the Aztec Empire, talks about the cacao seller and how the good cacao seller sells these wonderful, beautiful, plump cacao beans, and how the evil cacao seller sells these bad, shriveled beans filled with cotton or dust or these other materials to make them look plumper. So we do know that this was a problem. Another interesting aspect of cacao money is that because it is comestible, you can, to some degree, control the amount of it in circulation, depending on whether or not it spoils, whether or not you drink it, whether or not you eat it in some way. And so you had to be very, very well off indeed in order to drink your money. So it creates some really interesting, conspicuous consumption in the best way. And we actually find vessels that have had cacao residues in elite tombs dating from probably the late Formative, as early as the middle Formative, but sort of around 300 BC, these little spouted chocolate pots that have been hypothesized to be for frothing cacao beverages become really important in a lot of the larger monumental centers of that period. So we think that that was indeed a bit of a period of conspicuous consumption where you could literally drink your money in front of the entire royal court. And then later on, these beautiful vases that are labeled as for drinking cacao, whether or not they actually were, not all of them have residues, but these become gifts that become traded among royal families and between royal courts. So there was a whole social aspect to the, let's say, the luxury element of cacao consumption and trade, but that again would have bolstered the value of cacao beans in the face of ordinary transactions and at smaller scales, literally where a rabbit is costing you 4 cacao beans, at least according to the Aztecs.
We'll leave you all with this fun final question. So what is the most valuable item that you found on the site, on your site?
I think that's such a subjective question. Thank you, Emiliano, for asking it. I do appreciate it. I think in order to say that, I really have to think about what we see in the archaeological record about how materials are being treated. You know, not necessarily what I would consider them or maybe their market value, but what we see in terms of the patterns of where they're ending up. And I think to the people at Moxviquil, what we really see is that jade and shell beads, that really old form of currency, those are the things that are ending up in the tombs, and those are the things that are going into the funerary caves and the deposits with the rulers. Whether or not that means that they had sort of an ultimate monetary value in everyday life, it's hard to say. And we didn't find any cacao drinking vessels. We actually, there are some, I'll take that back. There are some cylindrical vases that have not been tested that are in tombs and caches. So I may have to literally eat my words and eat my money on that in the form of cacao beans. There could have been cacao beans in those vessels, I suppose. But in terms of what we see in the archaeological record as we understand it right now, we see them taking their ornaments, their greenstone beads and their olive shell beads into the tombs with them. And so at least from the royal family's perspective, I think we can say that that was what they thought was worth taking with them. So I hope that answered your question.
I'm sorry, everybody. My computer just completely quit on me. So I hope you can hear me on my cell phone.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much for joining. This was a lovely presentation. Thank you so much, Liz, for today. We all hope to see you again next week, and have a lovely day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone so much for coming to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much. And thank you, Marina, and thank you to the Nickle Gallery for hosting this.